The desert stretched wide and endless, a land where the sun burned hotter than any man's anger and the nights could freeze colder than sorrow. Dust swirled in the wind, carrying the weight of old stories, of blood spilled and promises broken. It was a land of silence, where every footstep seemed to echo forever, and every choice carried the weight of survival. Out here, trust was as rare as rain, and hope clung to the earth like the last stubborn roots of a dying tree. He was a cowboy, hardened by years on the trail, a man who had seen too much and learned to expect little from the world. His eyes carried a quiet storm, and his steady hands had guided 1,000 reins and drawn 1,000 guns. To most, he was another wanderer on horseback, passing through towns and fading into memory. But to him, the land was alive, whispering truths only those who listened with their soul could hear. And on one such day, when the wind was thick with dust and silence pressed heavy, fate set before him something he never thought he would find. She was wild. That was the word every settler, every outlaw, every soldier whispered when her name passed their lips. An Apache girl, born of fire and spirit, untamed as the cliffs that carved the horizon. She had eyes sharp as eagle's wings, a spirit that refused to bow, and a silence that spoke louder than any cry. Some said she was cursed, others swore she was blessed by the old spirits themselves. None could claim to understand her, and none dared to try. She was a shadow in the desert, untouchable, unbroken, feared and admired in the same breath. Their worlds should never have crossed. He belonged to the saddle, to the lonely trail and the weight of his past. She belonged to the mountains, to the old ways of her people, to a freedom no man had ever held. But fate often works in cruel and beautiful ways, twisting paths together when least expected. It began on a day when the canyon winds carried danger. The cowboy had been riding for hours, his horse weary, the trail long. He did not know the soldiers had set traps, nor that outlaws hunted shadows across the desert. He did not know that in the heart of the canyon, a girl who had never bowed her head was being hunted like an animal. All he knew was the sound, the echo of hooves, pounding too fast, too desperate. And then he saw her. She stumbled across the rocks, her wrists raw from rope, her dress torn from struggle. Dust clung to her hair, sweat to her brow, but her spirit burned like fire in her eyes. Behind her thundered men on horses, their guns ready, their shouts sharp as knives in the air. For a moment, the cowboy thought she might be a vision, a spirit sent by the desert to test his heart. But the gunshots that cracked against the canyon walls were all too real. And the way she turned, defiant even in fear, struck something deep within him. Without thinking, his hand moved. His revolver sang its steel song, and the canyon filled with smoke and chaos. Horses reared, men cursed, and bullets shattered against stone. He rode hard into the fray, dust swallowing him whole. His only thought to shield the girl, whose eyes burned with more fight than all the men chasing her. He did not ask who she was, nor why they hunted her. He only knew that something in her spirit called to him, and for once he could not ride past. When the dust cleared, when the echoes of gunfire faded into silence, the canyon held only two figures: the cowboy, chest rising with the weight of choice, and the girl, fierce even in her exhaustion. Her wrists still bound, but her gaze unbroken. For the first time, their eyes met, and the world seemed to pause. She did not thank him, did not speak. She only stared, as though trying to decide if he was yet another man who sought to cage her spirit, or if he was something else entirely. The cowboy sat silent in his saddle, torn between leaving her to the wilderness and offering the safety he wasn't sure he could give. Something in her gaze unsettled him, something that cut deeper than any knife, sharper than any bullet. It was not fear. It was not gratitude. It was something older, something that made him wonder if he had just stepped into a story larger than himself. The desert grew quiet again. the wind carrying only whispers. He knew that by taking her with him, he was inviting a storm. Soldiers would hunt them. Outlaws would follow. And her spirit, untamed and fierce, might turn on him as quickly as the world outside. But he also knew one truth: something in her presence had struck a chord he had long forgotten. A peace he had not known in years seemed to linger when she was near. Though she had yet to say a word, he reached for his knife, cutting the rope from her wrists. She pulled away the instant she was free, standing tall despite her weariness, her eyes sharp as the desert hawk. She did not run. She did not bow her head. She only stood, silent and unyielding, as if daring him to prove what kind of man he truly was. The cowboy held her gaze, the weight of choice heavy on his shoulders. The canyon stretched before them, endless and uncertain, the sun burning overhead as if watching their every move. Neither spoke. Neither moved. Only the wind stirred between them, carrying the promise of storms yet to come. And in that silence, with the desert holding its breath, one truth began to take root deep within him. He had saved her life. But it was she who might one day save his soul. The canyon air still hung heavy, carrying the faint smell of gunpowder and dust. The cowboy's horse shifted beneath him, restless from the fight, ears flicking back and forth as if it too felt the tension between the man and the girl. She stood there, wrists raw and marked from rope, her chest rising steady but proud. There was no thankfulness in her face, no softness in her eyes, only the kind of sharp defiance that warned a man not to mistake her silence for weakness. He had ridden through countless towns, faced down outlaws with quick hands and colder hearts. Yet nothing unsettled him quite like the stillness of this moment. He could have turned his horse and left, telling himself it was not his burden to carry. But something rooted him in place. Something about her gaze, fierce yet carrying a hidden pain, kept him there. He wondered who had tied her hands, who had chased her like a wild animal, and what she had done to bring such relentless pursuit upon herself. The girl finally moved, taking a slow step back, as if testing whether the cowboy meant her harm. She did not run, though. The wide desert stretched open behind her. Instead, she studied him, the lines of his weathered face, the steady grip he had on his reins, the revolver holstered but never truly at rest. Her people had taught her long ago to read the truth in a man's eyes. And though she found no cruelty in his, she found no promises either. That made him dangerous in a different way. The cowboy cleared his throat, his voice low and rough from years of dust and long rides. "They'll come back," he said, nodding toward the canyon's edge where hoofprints marked the earth. "Best you don't stay here." He expected her to say something, to at least reveal if she understood his words. But she remained silent. Only the wind answered, carrying grains of sand across the stone. He thought of riding off, leaving her to whatever fate the desert had chosen. But the thought lingered bitter in his chest. There was something wrong about turning away. He knew what it was to be hunted, to have the world chasing you without pause. He knew that fire in her eyes, the refusal to kneel, because once upon a time it had lived in him too. And maybe that was why he couldn't walk away. Slowly, he dismounted, boots sinking into the hot dust as he stood face to face with her. He offered his canteen, but she didn't take it. Her chin lifted, as if accepting water would be surrender. The cowboy nodded, almost respecting her defiance, and placed it on the rock instead. "For when you're ready," he said. The silence stretched long between them until the girl finally stepped forward, her hand brushing the canteen, not out of trust, but necessity. She drank quick and sharp, then tossed it back to him as though to say she owed him nothing. He caught it, the corner of his mouth twitching just enough to show he admired her spirit. Night was coming. The shadows grew longer, the canyon walls turning golden red with the sinking sun. The cowboy knew the land too well to let darkness catch them exposed. He glanced toward the girl again, still standing tall, though her body showed the weight of exhaustion. "Camp's safer with fire," he said. "But fire's a beacon, too." He didn't expect an answer. But she surprised him by tilting her head, her eyes narrowing with thought, almost as if she weighed his words carefully. They rode in silence until the canyon gave way to open desert, where jagged rocks and twisted brush offered cover. The girl rode his horse while he walked beside, reins steady in his hand. She did not thank him for giving her the saddle, but she didn't resist either. Every step was a quiet bargain between them, an unspoken truce forged not by trust but by necessity. As night fell, the cowboy built a small fire hidden against the rocks. Its light faint, but enough to keep the cold away. The girl sat across from him, her knees pulled close, her hair catching the fire's glow. He watched her without speaking, trying to piece together who she was beyond the whispers he'd heard in frontier towns. He'd heard of an Apache girl no one could tame, a spirit so fierce even her own people feared what she might become. Could this be her? She caught him staring, her eyes flashing sharp like the edge of a blade. For a moment, he thought she might spring at him. But instead, she looked away, as if his curiosity was nothing worth answering. Still, that silence told him more than words could. She was guarding herself, holding her story close as a shield. The cowboy leaned back against the rock, his hat low over his brow, but his mind restless. He thought of the men who had chased her, their guns eager, their shouts full of hate. They hadn't chased her like a thief or an outlaw. They had chased her like something to be broken. And that thought burned in him, stirring an anger he hadn't felt in years. The girl did not sleep that night. He saw her eyes glint in the firelight, always watching, always waiting. When the coyotes howled in the distance, she didn't flinch. When the fire cracked, she didn't stir. She was as much a part of the desert as the rocks and the sand. By dawn, the cowboy knew one thing keeping her with him would draw trouble like vultures to a corpse. The soldiers, the outlaws, maybe even her own people, they would all come. Yet he also knew leaving her behind was not an option he could live with. Something in her presence unsettled him, like she was both danger and salvation. And the thought of riding away gnawed at him worse than the hunger in his belly. When the sun rose, painting the desert in hues of gold, he saddled the horse and looked toward her. "If you ride with me, you'll have to trust me," he said simply. She didn't move, didn't speak, but the faintest flicker in her eyes told him she'd heard. Slowly, she stepped toward the horse, climbing up without a word as they set off across the open desert. The horizon stretched wide and endless, filled with questions neither dared to ask. He wondered if she would ever tell him who she was, why men wanted her captured or dead. She wondered if he would betray her like all the others who had tried to own her spirit. The trail ahead was uncertain, shadowed by danger. Yet something in both of them knew the journey had already begun, and though the desert gave no answers, the silence between them spoke of storms that had only just begun to gather. They rode into the second day with the sun already mean and the wind sharp enough to scrape a man's patience to the bone. The cowboy picked a line of travel that hid them among broken ridges and mesquite, keeping two sand gullies where hoofprints blurred fast. He did not talk much. The girl spoke not at all. Yet the space between them kept filling with questions. He felt them rise in his chest whenever he glanced back and saw her sitting straight in the saddle, as if she carried a whole nation on her shoulders. Around noon, he guided them to a shelf of stone with a thin streak of water running through it. It was no river, only a spring licking its way out from under the rock like the land itself was bleeding. The horse drank first. Then the girl knelt and cupped her hands, eyes half closed as if listening to something he could not hear. The cowboy crouched nearby, not wanting to break the calm that had settled there. He had seen hard men come to water with eyes like hers, as if they were greeting an old friend. He pulled a roll of jerky from his saddlebag and offered half. At first, she ignored him. Then she took it with a quick, sure motion and bit into it, never looking away from the spring. He was about to say they needed to keep moving when she finally spoke. The sound of her voice surprised him. It was low and steady, like a drumbeat carried across the plains. "You do not ride toward town," she said. "You ride away. Town is trouble," he answered. "Trouble rides faster when it has a roof." She seemed to weigh the words, then nodded once. A small acceptance. He took it for what it was and said no more. But his mind kept working. Town would have given them a fresh horse, supplies, maybe a bed. It also would have given the men who chased her a trail clear as a road sign. He would not risk that. Not today. By late afternoon, they were little more than smudges in the heat. Skirting a sea of rock, where the ground opened like a broken jaw. He guided them through a split in the cliffs and into a wash with cottonwoods thin as knife blades. The shade tasted like mercy. He meant to rest there until dusk, then ride by starlight. But they were not alone. A woman stepped from behind a trunk. Gray hair tied in a knot. Overalls dusty. A rifle held easy across her chest. The cowboy's hand drifted near his holster, but stopped as the woman gave a small smile. "Easy trail, man," she said. "A barrel pointed at a stranger only makes noise. I prefer quiet." The girl had turned to stone on the horse's back, eyes narrowed. The woman noticed and offered a slow nod, like a neighbor greeting another across a fence. "I keep a small patch of ground and a poorer patch of goats upriver," the woman said. "Name's not important. I saw you two ride in like a storm. That usually means a storm is close behind." The cowboy did not argue. He asked if there was a path through the canyon that avoided the road. The woman glanced at the girl, then back to him. "There's a path," she said. "Belongs to people older than fences and gates. Not mine to give. But if the young one wishes it, can show the start." The girl slid down from the saddle and stood there, steady as granite, considering the stranger. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition the cowboy could not place. Perhaps it was only the quiet understanding of those who have survived under a sky that gives little. "Show the start," the girl said at last. The woman led them to a rock face where the canyon teeth bit into the sky. She pressed her palm to a seam in the stone, and the seam opened into a narrow passage no man on a fast horse would notice. The cowboy tied the horse and guided it through sideways, heart thumping as the walls slid close against his shoulders. They emerged into a bowl of earth hidden from the world, with a creek threading through bunches of green. The air was cooler, the sound of water soft as a lullaby. "You'll be safe here for a short while," the woman said. But safe is a word that changes shapes. Men with badges came down the road this morning. Men without badges came after. They asked hard questions about an Apache girl and the rider who took her part. They spoke like the desert belonged to them. The girl's mouth tightened. The cowboy kept his face plain, but a quiet fire sparked in his chest. He asked what the badgemen claimed. They claimed she had taken something, the woman said. A map to a spring or a vein of silver. Hard to say. Their story shifted with the wind. The other men said a different thing. Said she knew secrets about a treaty camp. Said she was a witness and that witnesses make trouble if they live long enough. The cowboy watched the girl. She stared at the water. He knew then the story was larger than either rumor. He wondered which part of it would crush them first. When the woman left, the girl knelt by the creek and traced lines in wet sand. At first, he thought she was drawing nothing at all. Then he saw shapes appear. A mesa cut like a tooth. A chalk-white arch. A spiral that looked like wind carved into stone. She tapped the mesa with her finger. "Soldiers ride there," she said. "They want a spring that is not theirs." Outlaws carry guns for them on some days and for money on others. My people say, no. They burned one of our camps with words first and fire after. I ran, not because I am afraid. I ran because I saw who led them. She drew another line, a simple stick figure with a hat tilted a certain way. No name, only a shape. The cowboy felt something inside him go still. He knew the tilt of that hat. He had ridden with it for a season years back when he was younger and angrier. He had shared fires with that man, listened to plans that tasted sour but felt easy. He had left before the work turned uglier. He had kept riding and tried to forget. You cannot outrun a shadow that rides your own horse. You know him, the girl said quietly. It was not a question. The cowboy's jaw worked once before he answered. I know of him. He trades his loyalty to whoever pays in gold and promises. He was near a raid in the river basin long ago. Men said it was soldiers who broke that camp. I saw the marks left behind. It looked like greed with a face and a smile. The girl brushed the sand flat with the edge of her hand. He wears a badge now, she said. Not the kind of badge that keeps peace. The kind that opens doors. He hunts me because I know the path to the spring and the words our elders spoke. If those words are twisted, more land is taken. If the spring is found by force, more graves are dug. The cowboy felt the world narrow to the shape of the canyon. The main conflict had shown its face. A man he once followed was driving soldiers and hired guns into sacred ground under cover of a crooked deal. The girl was the last witness who could speak for the truth. Saving her was not enough. Protecting her only delayed a storm already breaking on the horizon. But speaking her truth in town would get her locked away or silenced. Night rolled in slow, bringing the kind of darkness that swallows sound. He set a small camp and gave the horse the last of the grain. The girl wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, but did not sleep. He did not either. Instead, he talked low, telling small fragments of his wandering life. How he learned to read sign in the dust. How the trail made orphans of men who were never boys for long. He did not tell her about the winter he once wore a different hat and made worse choices, though he knew that secret would meet them down the trail. Toward dawn, she told a piece of her story, words chosen like careful steps on a cliff path. She spoke of an elder who had taught her to listen to stones because stones do not lie. She spoke of a ceremony cut short by riders who did not see the people before them, only land to be flattened into maps. She had run not to escape, but to carry a message to a place where voices could be heard. She did not believe such a place existed anymore, but she ran anyway. The cowboy listened and said nothing, because some stories asked for silence to keep them strong. By daylight, he had a path in mind. There was a mission farther north, run by a quiet preacher who dealt more in food and shelter than sermons. The man had helped the forgotten without choosing sides, which meant both sides disliked him and left him be. If anyone could hide the girl long enough to plan a next move, it was him. The river cut near the mission. They would have to cross open ground to reach it. Open ground made a man feel naked. Sometimes there is no other way. They rode from the hidden bowl with the sun just starting to warm the rock. The cowboy watched the sky for hawks and the ridges for riders. All morning passed clean. Around midday, they found wagon tracks joining the wash, deep and fresh. He reined in and crouched to read the sign. 4 mules, 1 iron rim cracked on the right. 2 riders alongside. Not soldiers. Hired hands, maybe. The tracks angled toward a gap where the land fell into a basin like a giant's footprint. The same direction they needed. He chewed the inside of his cheek, then guided them forward, using the tracks to mask their own. When they reached the edge of the basin, he saw the wagon below, stuck where a wheel had bit into a cut bank. 2 men worked the lever while a third cursed the sun. The fourth sat the saddle and watched the world with the bored look of a man who only wakes for danger. His look sharpened when he saw the cowboy and the girl. After noon, the cowboy called, keeping his hands visible. "You look a pair short for that job." "Wheels sunk," the watcher said. Spoke cracked. "We'll make it out." "You from the ranch north of here, I'm from the trail," the cowboy said. The watcher's gaze shifted to the girl. Hard to mistake the set of her shoulders and the way she rode. The world had put a price on that silhouette. The cowboy saw the watcher make the math in his head. He saw the moment coin beat caution. "Boss pays for news of an Apache girl," the watcher said. "Pays more if the news comes with the girl." The cowboy smiled without humor. "Boss's money ever buy water when your canteen ran dry? Money buys canteens," the watcher said. He whistled, and the other men straightened, hands sliding toward rifles. In that single heartbeat, the girl moved first. She hooked her leg and slid off the horse, landing in scrub like a wild cat. She sprinted toward the wash, drawing their eyes away from the rider beside her. The cowboy kicked his horse hard, angling to put the animal between her and the rifles. A shot cracked. Dirt spat near the girl's feet. Another shot sang off rock. The cowboy's revolver cleared leather like it was born there, his wrist steady, but he fired to break aim. Not to break men. A plume of dust rose by the watcher's stirrup. The horse reared, and the watcher pitched sideways with a curse. His shot flying high. The girl dove behind a stone shelf, and the cowboy wheeled to follow, keeping the horse moving so no single target presented itself. He saw the wagon men drop their rifles, suddenly more worried about their stuck wheel than a dead rider's reward. That left the watcher, who had crawled to the bank with his rifle propped across it. The cowboy knew he could end the fight with one clean pull. He also knew every choice echoes. He fired again at the dirt, a hand's breadth from the watcher's cheek. The man flinched, then cursed, then stayed down. They pulled away fast, the horse climbing the ridge with the kind of strength a rider thanks under his breath. When they were clear, the girl looked at him, surprised. He had not spilled blood when it would have been easy. He met her gaze and shrugged. "Dead men send news just as far as living men," he said. "Either way." Word rides on the wind. The basin opened to a plain of ghost grass and shallow ponds that turned the sky in two. Patches of broken glass. The mission lay beyond, a low building with a bell that was always broken and a garden that never was. He could almost see it already, feel the cool stone and the calm of a man who spoke softly. But trouble does not skip a day because a man hopes. As they approached the last rise, the cowboy noticed the hush that falls when the world waits for something to happen. No birds, no wind. Even the horse breathed quieter, like it had learned manners. He pulled up and took out the spyglass he kept wrapped in a scarf. Through it, he saw riders by the mission wall. Not many. Enough to start a fire or end one. A flag hung from a lance, plain cloth dirtied by dust. It was not army. It was worse. The mark belonged to that man with the tilted hat. The girl touched his sleeve, eyes locked on the rider's. He felt her hand tremble for the first time. So slight it might have been the wind, but the wind had stopped. He closed the spyglass and considered the ground around them. To the left, a ditch that could hide them for a time. To the right, a trail of cottonwoods leading to the river bend where the current cut hard against rock. Ahead, a wall of men who would not pause to ask questions. The choice felt like a coin spinning. He heard in memory the kind voice of the preacher who gave food without asking a man to kneel. He saw the tilted hat in his mind, grinning at a deal that ate the heart out of a nation. He felt the girl's breath steady again, a sign she would face whatever came without bending. "Which way?" she asked. He looked toward the river, measuring the distance, the depth, the speed, trying to see what waited there. He looked back at the mission, where a bell should have rung and did not. He weighed the ditch, which could turn into a trap as tight as a coffin. He listened to the quiet and wished for one useful sound. Somewhere beyond the mission, a single shot raised a flock of crows. The riders moved like a hand closing into a fist. The cowboy's fingers tightened on the reins as he made his choice. Ready to speak it, when a rider broke from the group and turned his horse straight toward them. The tilted hat caught the light for a moment, and the past galloped up to meet the present. The man lifted his hand in a lazy salute, as if greeting an old friend. The cowboy felt the old stain rise in his chest. The one you get from following the wrong man for too long. He pushed the feeling down and leaned toward the girl. "Ride when I say," he whispered. "Do not look back." But the rider with the tilted hat was already closing the last yards. Lips curved like he had been expecting this exact moment. He lifted his voice so calm it might have been a Sunday conversation on a porch. "Trailman," he called. "You always did have a soft spot for lost causes." The girl slid her hand toward the small knife hidden in her belt. The cowboy watched the man approach and wondered which old choice would cost them first. The river roared harder in his ears, though it was still far off. And the sky seemed to lean closer, as if it too wanted to hear what came next. The man with the tilted hat reined his horse a stone's throw away. His smile steady, his eyes hard as dry flint. The cowboy kept his own face calm, though his hand hovered close to the grip of his revolver. The girl stood half behind him, her small knife drawn but hidden by the fold of her blanket. Around them, the world had grown so quiet that every breath felt loud. "You've come a long way," the man with the hat said, his voice smooth like a snake sliding over rock. "I figured you'd keep running, but no, you ride straight toward me. Makes me think you've learned nothing." The cowboy didn't answer. He just watched the way the man sat his horse, loose but ready, and the way his men gathered behind the mission walls. They weren't restless. They were waiting. That meant a plan, and plans in this desert usually meant blood. The girl's grip tightened on her knife. She leaned closer and whispered, "He wants to speak, but his hand says he wants to kill." The cowboy gave the barest nod. He understood. Words here were just smoke before fire. The tilted hat man's grin widened. "You're carrying trouble, trail man. That girl of yours, she holds more than anyone needs to know. You could hand her over, ride off clean, and maybe even get paid. Or you could keep riding with her and end up like the bones we pass out here every day. Choice is yours." The cowboy shifted his weight, not toward surrender, but toward the fight he knew was coming. "Last time I rode with you, I saw what your choices bought. They weren't worth the coin. Still ain't." A flicker crossed the man's face, gone almost as quick as it came. He laughed then, a short, sharp sound that didn't reach his eyes. Behind him, the riders moved like shadows, spreading to close every gap. The girl suddenly stepped forward, her voice sharp and clear. "You burned the camp by the river. You took children. You think no one remembers, but I remember. I saw you with my own eyes." For the first time, the man's smile thinned. He turned that cold gaze on her, and the cowboy felt the air grow heavier. The girl had thrown fire into dry brush, and now the blaze would come fast. "You talk too much," the man said. He raised his hand, and the riders shifted their rifles. The cowboy swung up into the saddle in one motion, pulling the girl with him. "Hold on," he muttered. Then spurred the horse hard toward the cottonwood trail to the river. Shots cracked like thunder chasing them. Bark splintered from the trees as bullets struck, leaves scattering down like dying birds. The horse stretched its stride, hooves pounding the earth in a rhythm that matched the beating in the cowboy's chest. He leaned low, shielding the girl with his body. Feeling the hot rush of danger graze past like sparks from a forge. The river came into view, swollen and fast, crashing against the rocks with a voice that drowned the world. The cowboy knew it was no safe crossing, but behind them, death rode faster. He pulled the reins toward the bend where the current bit deepest. The girl clutched him tight. "They'll follow," she said. "I know," he answered. They reached the bank just as more riders broke from the mission. Their shouts carried over the roar of the water. The cowboy kicked his horse forward, and the animal leapt into the river with a cry, landing hard as the current seized it. Cold water surged up, pulling, clawing, dragging them downstream. He clung to the saddle horn with one arm, holding the girl with the other, every muscle straining against the force that wanted to tear them apart. Behind them, more riders plunged into the current. The tilted hat man himself stayed on the far bank, watching like a hawk, certain the river would do his work for him. The cowboy's horse fought with all its strength, swimming crooked, lunging toward a stretch of gravel where the water broke weaker. The girl slipped once, her fingers clawing into his coat. He hauled her back, teeth clenched, the weight of her life heavier than the water. At last they reached the far side, collapsing onto the stones. The horse staggered, dripping, sides heaving like bellows. The girl lay gasping, but alive. The cowboy rose, water streaming from him, and saw shapes still battling the current behind them. Some riders were dragged under, their shouts cut off by the flood. Others pushed through, angling for the same gravel shore. He pulled the girl to her feet. "We can't stay," he said. They scrambled up a steep rise, slipping on wet rock, climbing hand over hand until they reached a ledge. From there, they could see the chase strung out across the river, riders scattering, some crawling from the water, others swept away. The tilted hat man had not crossed. He sat on his horse with the calm of a man who never risks when others can do the dying for. Him, the girl's eyes burned as she looked down. He won't stop. He'll keep hunting until nothing is left. The cowboy knew she was right. The man was not after just her, but everything she carried, everything she knew. The spring, the words of her elders, the truth of what had been stolen. That kind of power made men greedy enough to follow until their boots turned to dust. They pressed on through the rocks, following a goat trail that twisted higher into the cliffs. Each step scraped their lungs raw. Behind them came the echoes of men regrouping, rifles clinking, curses thrown across the canyon. The sun dipped lower, casting the land in firelight. The day was dying, but the fight was just beginning as night rose. The cowboy found a shallow cave and pulled the girl inside. They lit no fire. They ate little. The dark pressed close, broken only by the glint of stars and the occasional flicker of torches moving in the valley below. The girl sat quiet, then spoke. "He fears me because I remember. But fear makes men crueler. Tomorrow he will send more. He has many hands." The cowboy nodded. "And we've only ours." Silence hung, heavy with what neither said. To face the tilted hat man meant dragging the past into the open, facing not only his sins, but the cowboy's own. Once, long ago, he had chosen the easier trail and ridden with men like that. Now he had no choice but to stand against them, though the weight of it pressed like iron on his chest. Toward midnight, the girl whispered, "You could still leave me." He looked at her in the dim light, the fire in her eyes outshining the stars. "No, not now. Not after seeing what's at stake." The wind carried the sound of riders, faint but growing. The enemy was spreading, sweeping the ridges, hunting like wolves. The cowboy checked his revolver, counting the cartridges, knowing it would not be enough. The girl laid her knife across her knees, calm as stone. The night stretched long, each hour thick with dread. At dawn, the sky bled red across the horizon. The cowboy rose and looked out. Smoke curled from the valley below. The tilted hat man had burned something in the night. a message written in fire for all to see. The girl joined him at the cave mouth, her face carved in resolve. "He means to drive us out," she said. "He means to corner us," the cowboy answered. They started moving before the sun cleared the peaks. Their trail wound through jagged cuts, each turn a place where an ambush might wait. The air smelled of smoke and dust, and every shadow seemed to shift with threat. By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking the mission again. From there, they saw what had become of it. The small garden was trampled, walls blackened, the bell torn down and lying in the dirt like a broken tooth. Riders moved in and out, their banners planted high, claiming the ground. The tilted hat man stood at the center, directing with the calm of a man who thought the land already his. The girl's hands clenched. "He means to erase everything." The cowboy felt his jaw tighten. "Then the fight will find us whether we want it or not." As they watched, a group of riders split from the mission and began climbing the slope toward their ridge. The girl and the cowboy slid back behind rocks, hearts pounding. The hunt was closing in. The clash they had tried to outrun was no longer far. Every step now led them toward the storm, and there would be no turning aside. The cowboy touched the girl's arm. "Stay close. The moment will come when we can't hide. That's when we stand." She met his gaze, unflinching. "I was born for that moment." Below, the riders spread across the slope, rifles ready, eyes sharp. The tilted hat man raised his hand from the valley floor, a signal as old as war. The men began to climb faster, their boots pounding the rock. The cowboy drew his revolver. The girl raised her knife, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The storm they had carried for so long was finally breaking, and the clash that waited would decide more than their own lives. It would decide whose truth the desert would remember. The riders closed in fast, their boots scraping rock, rifles glinting in the harsh sun. The cowboy steadied his revolver, every sense sharpened by the nearness of the fight. Beside him, the girl crouched low, her knife firm in her hand, her breath calm. The sound of hooves and voices rose from below, and with it came the weight of choice. They had reached the place where running no longer mattered. The first rider crested the ridge and the cowboy fired. The crack split the air and the man fell back, his rifle tumbling away. Another rider lunged forward, but the girl moved like a flash, her blade finding its mark, swift and certain. The narrow trail became a storm of shouts and smoke. The cowboy's revolver spoke again and again, each shot measured, each one tearing into the line of men forcing their way up. But there were too many. For each that fell, another pressed harder. The cowboy knew they could not hold this ridge forever. He glanced at the girl, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but a fierce light, the kind that comes when someone has chosen not to bend. They pulled back deeper into the rocks, using the ground as their shield. The men climbed higher, driven by the tilted hat man's command below. He stood apart, his horse steady, his hand raised like a judge ready to deliver final judgment. He never rushed. He trusted the numbers, trusted the hunger of men who followed his promise of land and coin. The fight stretched on, bullets sparking against stone, dust rising in choking clouds. The cowboy's revolver ran dry. He reached for the girl, pulling her close as another rider charged. They met the attack together, his strength and her sharp precision driving the man back. The bond between them held stronger than steel. At last the cowboy saw it, the opening he had waited for. Among the scattered rocks lay one of the fallen men's rifles. He dove for it, snatching it up as a bullet grazed his shoulder. Pain flared, but did not stop him. He rose to his knees, sighted down the ridge, and found the tilted hat man sitting proud and untouchable below. Their eyes locked across the distance. The cowboy pulled the trigger. The shot rang true, and the tilted hat man jerked, clutching his chest as his horse reared. He toppled to the ground, his hat rolling across the dust. For a moment, silence fell. The riders froze, their leader fallen. The spell that had bound them broke. Some dropped their rifles and fled back down the slope. Others simply stood, stunned, until the weight of choice drove them to scatter into the desert. The chase was over. The cowboy lowered the rifle, chest heaving. The girl stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the valley where smoke still rose from the burned mission. "It's done," she said softly. He nodded, though his heart still beat hard with the echoes of the fight. They climbed down slowly, moving past the bodies, past the scattered guns left in haste. When they reached the valley floor, the tilted hat man lay still, his face pale, his hand clenched in the dirt. The girl stood over him, quiet for a long time, then knelt and took back a small charm he had stolen long ago. She held it close, her eyes wet but her jaw firm. The cowboy touched her shoulder. "He can't hurt anyone anymore." Her voice trembled, though her words were steady. "He took so much. But the land remembers. We remember. That is stronger than him." Together they walked toward the mission. The walls were blackened, the bell broken, yet the ground still held the smell of earth and roots. The girl knelt in the garden where ashes smoldered and pressed her hand to the soil. "It lives," she whispered. "It can grow again." The cowboy stood watch as she worked, his eyes always scanning the horizon, though no riders came. The desert stretched wide, silent except for the wind carrying away the last traces of gunfire. Days passed. They buried the dead, those who had fought for greed and those who had fought to protect. The girl sang quiet words in her own tongue as the graves were covered. The cowboy did not understand the words, but he felt the weight of them, like stones laid one by one to mark what should never be forgotten. When their work was done, they sat by the river, the same river that had nearly swallowed them. The water ran clear now, the roar softer, like a voice of peace after storm. The girl looked across the current. "I thought I was alone. I thought no one would stand beside me." The cowboy shook his head. "You were never alone. You just hadn't found someone stubborn enough yet." Her laugh was small, but it broke the heaviness. For the first time, the lines of fear eased from her face as the sun sank red over the horizon. The cowboy knew their trails would not part. They had carried each other through fire and river, through shadow and loss. In that bond was a kind of peace he had never known, the kind that did not come from coin or land, but from standing true when it mattered. The mission slowly came alive again. Shoots of green broke through the burned soil. Birds returned to the trees along the river. Travelers who once avoided the valley began to pass through, pausing to rest where the girl and the cowboy had worked to rebuild. Word spread of what had happened, of how a man in a tilted hat had fallen, and how the land had found its guardians once more in the quiet evenings. When the stars burned bright, the cowboy would sit by the fire while the girl told stories of her people. Stories of rivers and mountains, of spirits that walked in the wind. He listened, not just to her voice, but to the way her spirit carried strength through every word. Those stories bound him deeper than any oath. The weight of his past never vanished, but it eased. Where once he had ridden with men like the one who now lay in the ground, he had chosen a different trail. That choice marked him more than his scars. One night, the girl asked, "Do you regret it? Saving me when you could have left me there?" He thought for a long time before answering. "No, it saved me, too." The wind carried the scent of sage and river water. The night was wide and calm, filled with promise instead of dread. For the cowboy, it was the first time in years that the horizon did not feel like a weight pressing down, but a path opening ahead. The story of the tilted hat man faded with the seasons, though his memory lingered as a warning. The land healed slowly, but it healed. Where ashes had been, flowers grew. Where blood had spilled, the river washed clean. And in the hearts of those who passed through, the tale of a cowboy and the wild Apache girl became more than just survival. It became a reminder of what it meant to stand against cruelty, to choose loyalty over fear, to remember that even in the harshest desert, peace could be found when two souls carried it together in time. The girl stood tall as a leader among her people, her voice steady, her spirit unbroken. The cowboy rode by her side, not as a shadow, but as a partner, bound not by chains, but by choice. Together, they guarded the spring, the garden, the memory of those lost. Together, they shaped a new trail that others could follow. And when strangers asked what brought them there, the cowboy would smile a rare smile and say, "I came chasing peace. Didn't know I'd find it in her." So the desert kept its secrets. The river kept its song, and the stars kept watch over a bond that outlived fire and storm. The cowboy who once wandered alone found his soul's peace in the girl no one could tame. And the girl who once carried only sorrow found in him a promise that the world could be different. That was the end of the trail. Not in dust and gunfire, but in the quiet strength of two hearts that had chosen to walk it together.